Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much. This is an important panel, and I would like to start by recognizing how much visibility Latinos still need to gain and how do we do it? What are the solutions? What are inspirations that we can have from leaders all across the country and the world about how do we raise Hispanic voices? We are in a crucial moment. We know it. There's a lot of momentum on diversity and inclusion. We have to take the opportunity as Hispanic community to raise our voices. So welcome, panelists. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I would like to start with Tony Marks. Tony, what is your what are things that you think can be done in your industry where we can use, like literature, libraries, authors to elevate Latino voices? Thank you so much for being here, by the way, and being our co-chair for this Hispanic Leadership Summit.
Well, Claudia, it's an honor to be with you, and you do such amazing work, and the summit is so spectacular and so timely. In answer to your question, look, the public libraries of America are the most visited civic institution in the country. That's certainly true in New York as well. There's nobody else even close as an institution. People rely on us for reading, for books, for space, for education programs, and they do so because they know they can trust us. We don't ask for any proof, any papers. Everybody is welcome and everybody is respected. But that's not enough. We need to make sure that our collections have what every community, including the Hispanic community, are looking for, and making sure they're readily available in the neighborhood as well as online. We need to make sure that in the organization, we have positions of leadership that can raise up Hispanic experience and voices and make sure that our services and collections are what the community need by being a part of that community, talking with that community. I'll give you just one example. When I arrived at the library a decade ago, I learned that here in the research collection, so separate from the circulating branch libraries that everybody knows and loves and uses, but here at the research library, we had one of the world's greatest Latin America collections. And we had, for whatever reasons, never had a single dedicated staff person, a curator for Latin America. That meant that the collection basically was sitting here dormant. There was no one making sure that it kept alive, adding to it, and even more importantly, reaching out to classrooms, to scholars, to students, to the community to say, here's what we have. Let us help you use this amazing set of resources. Thanks to Carlos Rodriguez Pastor, a trustee, we now have a Latin America curator for the first time on the staff of the New York Public Library. She's fantastic. That's just one example of how we need to make even just what we have readily available and used, in addition to making sure that what we have represents the interests of the community.
Thank you, Tony. Also, in a way, I've seen a proliferation of authors, African-American authors, like people putting more money in publishing new authors, new voices. I think that if I can look around, I don't see enough children books dedicated to Latinos so that they can have role models. I don't see enough history books about the Hispanic contribution to America historically. When did we start actually bringing agriculture and all that? So just one word of that before we pass.
There is amazing material out there, and we need to make sure that we're buying it and lending it and making it readily available for free. But in doing so, we also need to be priming the pump of demand, of saying to the publishing industry, to the author community, where there's amazing talent and interest, we need more of this material, and we're ready to buy it on behalf of the readers of New York.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Jillian, what about the media? What about the media industry, journalism? Do you see how do we actually elevate more Latino voices, both as journalists and as part of the coverage that is in papers?
I think it's a really interesting question, Claudia. I salute you on holding this summit. As Tony said, it's playing a very important role in raising awareness. I also salute what Tony's doing with the library, because it is indeed a really important pillar of civic society today. There's a really interesting situation right now in the media, which is in the last 2 years, because of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and all the tragedies that have unfolded there, often in full view, or rather in full cable television view and Instagram, there is rightfully a real sense of anger about the underrepresentation of the African American community, and a whole swathe of initiatives right now to try and address that, both in terms of coverage and thinking about what kind of coverage is fair and accurate and actually reflecting the diversity of America, but also in terms of the journalists that are being hired. And, you know, speaking on behalf of the Financial Times, we're doing a lot of initiatives to try and address the diversity inside the FT, and have made a number of hires, which we're very excited about. However, there has been a lot less focus on the Hispanic community, even though, as you yourself have pointed out many times, it's such a massive part of the American fabric, and such a dynamic and underappreciated part of the American fabric. And there aren't the similar kind of, you know, hiring initiatives, pipelines, NGOs, efforts for the Hispanic community in the media. And there certainly isn't the same level of debate underway about, you know, coverage and representation and whether it really reflects fairly what's going on. Why is that? Well, as you've talked about many times, Claudia, you know, the Hispanic community is a very diverse community in itself. You know, there are different stories behind different parts of the Hispanic community. It doesn't always see itself as a single community. You have the added issue that you have a separate channeled Spanish language or Portuguese language part of the media that's serving them, but obviously it then reinforces that sense of separation or creates potential ghettos. So all of that, you know, contributes to the sense of that actually Hispanic issues aren't getting the attention they deserve, and Hispanic reporters aren't necessarily receiving the same level of focus as they might deserve. So it's very important you're putting this on the agenda for discussion. As the composition of America changes and as the dynamism changes as well, it's going to become increasingly stark as an issue. And I simply posit that having more focus on the Hispanic community, looking at diversity in the widest possible sense within the American landscape, might be one way to potentially blur some of the excessively demarcated lines or the anger, hostility, or feeling of us and them between the African American community and the white community. When you start talking about many different shades of diversity and many different voices that need to be elevated, I think you get a much richer kind of debate, and perhaps a less polarizing one as well.
And Gillian, just to a follow-up question before, again, turning it to Antonio, but you know, like there's a lot of discussion, I think, that among Latino leaders about like we are, you know, like it's not about pressure, it's about making the business case and the case because Latinos are so much the growth. And nevertheless, what are things that we could scale up? What are initiatives that you have seen in the FT that have been, like, is it about scholarships or is it about internships? Where do we actually put some emphasis of what you have experienced that have made your you know, like your publication and others that you have seen more, you know, like more inclusive, both at pipeline level, employee level, but also at the coverage level?
I think there's essentially two things to do. One is to think about the employees we're hiring. Because the issues around the African American representation or underrepresentation have been so stark, and several NGOs have sprung up to specifically get talented young African Americans into the media. And there's a kind of pipeline pattern there. Now, there may be similar groups working in the Hispanic community, but if there are, I've never encountered them, and which speaks volumes, because I certainly had a lot of outreach from African American groups that are doing wonderful work. You know, one of the things that we are discovering is that you don't necessarily, it doesn't work best to operate by simply sitting still and expecting people to come to you. You may have to actually go out and actively find those interns and that pools of talent. It may mean going out to universities, which haven't traditionally been the first destination that journalistic groups have thought about when they've been trying to hire people. You know, get out of the Ivy Leagues, go down to some of the, you know, traditionally African-American colleges, go down and look down south, look at other areas other than just the traditional places that everyone focuses on to get the talent. Getting internships and thinking very actively about the economic disparities that often plague interns is incredibly important. And then trying to make sure that you have, you know, a culture inside your organization that tries to be truly colorblind and tries to rise above its prejudices. Last but not least, another lesson you can also learn is from thinking about some of the gender issues as well, because a few years ago at the FT, we created something we called the Janet Bot, which was named in honor of Janet Yellen. And it's an AI program that automatically tracks how many pictures of women there are in our website or in our mainstream paper to see how the women to male to female ratio of pictures goes. And to make sure we're not using unconscious biases in the sense of always turning to a male picture when we have a central banking topic. So Janet Bot with Janet Yellen. Things like that I know have been used within the African-American issues or debate. Again, it's harder to start talking about pictures and things necessarily within Hispanic, but thinking about how papers are actually covering these issues more systematically and stepping back could be another very interesting potential tool.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Antonio.
Encantado, Claudia. Pleasure to be here with you discussing this very, very, very important topic as it pertains to the lessons that we've learned in corporate America about diversity and inclusion. Pretty much the playbook has been written. The challenge continues to be as something that you and I have talked many times about, the application and the discipline and the focus and the commitment required to the application of that playbook. We know that we need to improve representation. It is bad in terms of the aggregate people of color. It is appalling when it comes to Hispanics. Then we have issues on inclusion as it pertains to building leadership capabilities as opposed to just functional capabilities, creating a sense of community, providing mentoring, and then providing company sponsorship for those candidates. And then we have an issue of measurements, which is at the end of this day, the reason that we're doing what we're doing is because we want to have significantly better business outcomes. And one of the things that we've done right is to identify the number of women and to make all sorts of correlations. And therefore, within the marketing community, you've seen a significant improvement in the number of women in senior marketing roles. For the first time last year, there are more women than men in CMO chairs, and that just happened over a 5-year period. It was measured, it was focused, the commitment was there, and you saw the results. It's not happening with people of color, and it doesn't happen with people of color. First, we aggregate as this black thing, black, brown, Asians, so on and so forth. And we need to get the same level of rigor and discipline with some of the things that Jillian was talking about. We need to look for talent in different places. And once we have this talent, we really need to nourish this talent through all the different inclusion areas that I mentioned before. One of the things, so that's what corporate America needs to do. One of the things that we need to do as a community, Claudia, and Jillian mentioned it as well, our Black brothers and sisters operate as a block, that our Asian brothers and sisters are becoming to operate as a block. We are typical Latin Americans that like to argue about anything. We're still arguing whether we call ourselves Latinos, Hispanics, or Latinx. We need to come together and begin to lobby it to the same level of extent and pressure that some of the other groups, or we're going to miss the single biggest business opportunity for the next 2 decades, in which the Latino Hispanic population is going to become close to 1/3 of the population. So those are some of the thoughts.
Antonio, stay there for a second. So I would like for all of you to react to each other if you have any reaction. And starting with you, Antonio, just like before reacting to what you heard from Tony and from Jillian, tell me what does success look like for you, like in terms of marketing dollars invested by companies in advertising that is portraying Latinos? How do we actually, what does success look like for you in the next, 3 and then 5 years? And then obviously, I would love to hear your reactions to each other from all of you.
I mean, again, if we take holistic and systemic change, which is what needs to happen within the marketing community, it means teams at the client side that are representatives of the communities that they're going to be serving, which means a significantly higher number of Latinos. That means also at the agency side. That means also at the productions side of it. And then you need to measure whether we are indeed depicting Latinos the right way, and there are all sorts of measurements about it. Sustainable progress across those 4 dimensions is what, for me, success would look like.
I'll jump in. Look, I think my colleagues are absolutely right. We live in New York. We live in New York in the United States. What makes New York the center of the world? Apologies, Jillian.
I'm in New York as well.
I know, but you do represent London.
No, well, I'm in the center right now, so for a reason.
And the reason why we became the center of the world is diversity, is the variety of people who've been welcomed here. It's never been perfect, God knows, but it's been different than the old world, coming from the Dutch tradition in the old world of New Amsterdam. It's why New York is so powerful. And what holds us back, and this is true of the country as well, is we don't use and embrace that difference and really say that difference is our richness. It brings different perspectives, different ideas, different experiences that help us understand each other, help us solve problems. It's the secret of America's success, and unlocking it more fully in all the ways that Antonio and Jillian have described is essential, whether that's in terms of staffing selection. Here at the library, we're now using the Rooney Rule, where we won't proceed with an appointment unless we have diversity in the senior, in the finalist group. We're concerned about the pipeline of getting qualified people up, whether we help that in the regular functions of the library or even in our own page program. We have hundreds of high school and college students, including lots of Hispanics, who are working in our libraries. It's their first job. It becomes a pipeline to careers in the library. 60% of our frontline staff come from this program. We've now invested in making it larger. We need more Hispanic presence there. We need it to be a full pipeline into not just careers in the library, but elsewhere, whether it's in administration, fundraising, finance, whatever it is. And then lastly, because we're a library, we need to make sure that our content reflects that diversity, is available both physically and online. And we know that not all communities are as online as they need to be. We need to help solve that problem as well. We need to get everybody on broadband so that everyone can get access to the content to learn about the Hispanic community, about each other. That's, our bread and butter, and we need to do better at that as well. The one thing we can't do is just sit around and rhetoricize. We don't have time for that anymore. And I think everybody understands that we, including leaders of institutions, need to be held to a higher, tougher standard because we haven't done well enough. Library has been a leader, and it's still not good enough.
Jillian?
Well, I think that Tony's being a bit modest there, because I think that, he certainly has been at the forefront of a lot of attempts to try and think about how, different groups are presented and portrayed. And, what happens in literature, what happens in libraries is a very powerful bellwether for the way that the wider conversation in society is happening. And I'll also just give a shout out for the work that the New York Public Library is doing in terms of trying to take digital connections, Wi-Fi, digitization out to a wider group of people, because again, that's part of pulling different diverse groups into the conversation. But I very, very strongly echo what Antonio said about the lack of a coordinated voice, about the lack of visibility, about the dangers of the Hispanic community going into ghettos and not engaging with the mainstream sometimes. And would simply say that, it's going to take a lot of leaders not merely rising up to the ranks of companies and political structures and civic institutions, but doing so with a proud Hispanic message. It's going to require a lot of that to actually get the conversation to change. Because another thing that's striking is that there are a number of Hispanic leaders out there, not many, but there are a number in business, say, in contrast to the African American community, who always carry their African American identity with them when they're interviewed or talked about, and are often presented as somebody who represents the community, sometimes unfairly, but they're always seen within that frame, and they always have that demonstration effect, if you like, about what's possible. We see far less of that in the Hispanic community. And so I guess one of the things I would call on is for the community to give the journalists and the media great stories to write about too.
Yeah, I could not agree more with both. What I like about what Tony said is at the end of the day, this is not about the beautiful panels like what we're doing right now, but it's about very specific actions. This is about change management. When you're talking about corporate structure, it is about setting very specific objectives with very specific strategies, with very specific plans of actions that are going to be measured, and then they're going to be adjusted according to those particular efforts. If the words are not translated into holistic systemic change management, we're going to continue to have these conversations for the next decade, and frankly, I don't have that time anymore. And going to what Gillian was saying, we need to actually tell more of our stories. One of the things that for many years we fought in corporate America are some Hispanics that will not acknowledge that they are Hispanic, because there's been so much prejudice within the corporate structure that it was better for them just to keep it quiet, or are still quiet, and they don't participate in some of the activities. That's real. There's nothing that is real. So the telling of the stories, embracing our Hispanic nature, and I thought the example is perfect, like some of our Black brothers and sisters are doing, is really, really important. I think it's more important than ever, together with all the cultural transformational change that we need to make at the different organizations.
And the way I say it, Claudia, because unfortunately I'm going to have to go in a minute, but I'd say, where is the Hispanic equivalent of Ken Chernow, formerly of American Express, Ken Frazier, or Ursula Burns? Where is that today? Because, we would love to be celebrating that and talking about it much more forcefully.
Right. And so I exactly, and that's part of, and that is part of what we're trying to do. We're trying, as World Human, to provide a framework with Hispanic stars to unify Latinos, as Antonio was saying, act as a block, but also to change our perception. And needless to say, I'm after your industries. I'm totally after the media industry covering us more, after CMOs saying like we're investing more, after authors and libraries and people like you. So my last question to all of you would be, if I would be you and you would be me, what would you think you would be asking from me? If I would be Tony Marks leading the New York Public Library and you would be an activist for the Latino community on unification and change of perception, what do you think is the right ask and the right tone? What would you do if you would be someone like me devoted to advancing Latinos and changing our perception, please?
Well, we are eager to partner. We are a part of this community and in every community. I mean, I think what we should get real and say, let's agree on some metrics and some goals and be precise and say, let's make sure that we have collections that reflect the Hispanic community, that they are circulating in those communities, that's happening online and offline, that the education programs, after school, homework help, English language. We have the biggest English language instruction outside of the schools for free. Is that all working? And is the organization reflecting this in terms of its appointments, its staffing, all of that? I think we should be held to, fairly tight standards. We are trying to do that for ourselves. We should be public about that and judged on the results. Yes, we have done amazing work, but even an institution that is committed to that amazing work, I think the point is that even that kind of an institution, even the library, can still do better. And this is the time when we all need to hold ourselves to account.
So I could say, as a public library, we will go and try to find the next 10 Latino authors and exemplify them and bring their books forward and try to push more publishers to actually publish more Latino children books and other.
Fabulous. Let's do it.
Gillian.
I would say, from my point of view, 3 quick things. One is I'd encourage media organizations to try and track this and actually look at it. First thing is to actually ask questions about what is the representation or the composition of journalists, if you can measure it. Doing that in relation to women and men has been very, very, has illuminated a lot and forced change. Second point is to talk about the composition of stories and to think about whether stories are being represented fairly or not. And the third thing is to, really try and get the message out and encourage, as Antonio said so forcefully, the Latino community to not only stick together, but to celebrate its triumphs and successes, because we just don't hear enough about that.
Yeah, Claudia, the one thing that you can do better than anyone is the power of convening. And if there's someone that can help us come together, bring people like Sol Trujillo, who's been an icon of the business community for many, many, many years, to actually begin to advocate in a more sort of consistent and focused way across the multiple dimensions, government, corporate, communities, the press, I think that would be a major, major step forward. And I would be happy to support it.
Well, I want to thank you, and I want to invite you, and I will convene you to join forces next Hispanic Heritage Month. I think it's a great opportunity to really break through the noise. I want to thank you, allies, particularly for being part of this journey. Tony, Marx, Gillian, Ted, Antonio, Lucio, thank you so much for your leadership, for being here. Thank you for the tips in raising Hispanic voices. I hope that next year we can see a difference, the way that we started seeing a difference this year already. I see more noise, I see more traction. So thanks to people like you and your leadership, we will continue going. Thank you so much, everybody.